The lights of the studio gleamed with artificial warmth, bright enough to blur edges and soften flaws, but too sharp to conceal tension. Daytime television had always been designed to appear harmless. Pastel backdrops, polished mugs on glass, tables easy chatter that slipped like water through the cracks of a long afternoon. Yet on this particular day the air felt heavy, like the stillness before a courtroom trial begins when the jury settles, and the gavel has not yet fallen. Adele sat at the panel, her figure framed by the brightness, her presence commanding without effort. She had not come to be tried. She had come, or so it was scheduled, to be celebrated. A voice of a generation, a working-class girl from Tottenham, who had risen to heights so few ever touched. But the audience watching at home, the live studio, attendees, even the women sitting around the table with her could feel it in the air. There was a reckoning brewing. Denise Welch leaned in, her expression casual, her body language cloaked in the friendly armor of daytime banter. Yet her eyes told another story. She was not merely a host this afternoon. She was an interrogator sharpening her questions like blades. The moderator's opening remarks floated away quickly, the way legal formalities do before the first strike in a heated trial. Cameras zoomed closer. The audience clapped politely, unaware that they were about to witness more than conversation. They were about to watch a collision. Adele shifted in her chair, her smile faint but already tight around the edges. She had played this role countless times before, the smiling guest, offering anecdotes, warmth, relatability. But every star knows when an interview takes a turn. Every defendant senses when questioning is no longer a courtesy, but a cross-examination. Denise cleared her throat softly, tilting her head as though concerned. Adele, people love you because you've always been so open. But lately, some say you've become guarded. The fans want to know why so distant now. It was not yet explosive, but the cadence, the insinuation, struck like the first crack of a whip. The audience leaned forward, not because the words were scandalous, but because the tone was. Adele's eyes flickered toward her. A pause hung in the air. Her reply came measured, her voice low and calm as though choosing every word with care. I've never stopped loving my fans, but loving them doesn't mean I owe every piece of my life to be displayed. The clash was subtle, almost polite, yet beneath it throbbed centuries of unspoken battles. The artist's right to privacy against the public's hunger for access, the individual's dignity against the marketplace's demand. The audience clapped again, but softer now, unsure if this was applause for wit or sympathy for a wound. The set lights flickered slightly as though straining to hold the atmosphere. Denise leaned back, her smile widening, but not with warmth. It was the smile of a barrister sensing the witness was on edge. But don't you think that part of what makes you who you are, Adele, is that connection? That people feel entitled to share in your struggles? Because you've sung them so beautifully for us? There it was. The unspoken accusation, dressed as affection. The suggestion that Adele had turned her back on the very intimacy that built her empire. Adele drew in a breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. The cameras caught it, the slight tremor, the restrained frustration. I've given everything I can through my music. That's the truest connection I know how to offer. My life outside of that, my son, my family, that's mine. That doesn't belong to the world. A hush fell over the set. It was the kind of silence that occurs not from boredom, but from recognition. The audience realized they were no longer spectators to entertainment. They were witnesses to testimony. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered into a headset, "Stay on her face. Don't cut away." Because this was the moment. Adele's jaw tightening, Denise's eyebrows arching, the other panelists, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, caught in the crossfire but unwilling to intervene. It was not yet shouting. It was not yet storming out. But the trial had begun, and the jury and millions of viewers had just been sworn in. The live audience shifted in their chairs, murmurs hushed quickly, like townspeople silenced by a bailiff's call. The stage was no longer a stage. It was a courtroom, and the verdict was not yet written. Beneath the studio's painted calm, the true battle lines began to show. The pastel colors and cheerful chatter were only a veil. What unfolded was not entertainment but conflict, two worlds colliding under the disguise of casual daytime television. Adele had entered the set not as just another guest, but as a cultural figure whose very existence challenged the rules of fame. She was Britain's daughter of grit and grief, the voice that poured pain into melody, who had offered the world not spectacle but soul. Denise Welch sat across from her embodying another Britain entirely, blunt, unsentimental, unfiltered. To the viewers, Denise was the everywoman who never softened her edges, the courtroom prosecutor of loose women who made her living pressing where others would tread lightly. The exchange carried undertones that reached beyond the set. It wasn't simply one celebrity and one presenter. It was something larger, something archetypal, authenticity battling scrutiny, privacy against exposure, a voice that asked to be heard only in song against a voice that demanded explanation, demanded confession. The air tightened as Denise leaned forward again. But don't you see, Adele? The people who bought your albums, who supported you through everything, they don't just want the music. They want you. They want to know the woman behind the voice. Don't you think it's fair to give a little more back? Her tone was soft, measured like a barrister cross-examining a witness, but the question hit like an accusation. It wasn't curiosity. It was pressure. Adele blinked slowly, her lashes lowering as though shielding herself from a glare. I give myself in every note I sing. That's not nothing, Denise, that's everything. When I write about heartbreak, when I sing about loss, I'm opening veins. I'm not sure what more people expect of me. The words dropped heavy, a declaration, yet there was a tremor beneath them. The exhaustion of a witness being asked to recount the same trauma again and again for a hungry jury. The other panelists tried to soften the air, offering quick interjections, a laugh here, a nod there, but they were background figures now. The duel belonged only to Adele and Denise, their exchange filling every corner of the room. The studio audience shifted, whispers slipping like rustling paper. Some tilted their heads sympathetically toward Adele, sensing her fatigue. Others leaned into Denise's argument. Wasn't it fair, after all, that the public who had crowned Adele wanted to share in the intimacy she once gave freely? A young woman in the audience covered her mouth, whispering to her neighbor, "It feels like she's on trial." And she was right. The set had become a courtroom, and every pair of eyes was fixed on the defendant at the center. Denise's hand tapped lightly against the desk, the rhythm deliberate, like a judge punctuating each word. "But Adele," she pressed, "don't you think closing yourself off now feels like a betrayal? Like you've forgotten where you came from?" The word betrayal hung like a charge sheet. Adele's back straightened, her shoulders stiff as if struck. Her response came low, quiet, but the restraint only sharpened its edge. "I've never forgotten where I come from. I've carried it in every song, every lyric. But I didn't fight my way out of those streets to hand over my private life like some public trophy. Fame doesn't mean surrender." The audience clapped, louder now, a divided jury voicing its split decision. Some cheered for Adele's defiance. Others shook their heads, murmuring that Welch was only asking what the people had a right to know. And there it was, the deeper conflict buried beneath casual conversation. It wasn't about one question or one answer. It was about entitlement. What society demands from those it elevates. It was about whether a woman, even one who sang her soul raw, was ever allowed to say, "Enough." The set was bright and polished, but in the undercurrent there was shadow, weight, consequence. The moment was no longer a mere interview. It had transformed into an ideological trial. Adele sat still, her fingers clasped together tightly in her lap, the faintest white pressing against her knuckles. She was calm, but every inch of her body carried tension, the quiet resolve of someone bracing under interrogation. Denise smiled, tilting her head, satisfied that she had pressed where it hurt. The other panelists exchanged uneasy glances, each aware that they were no longer part of friendly television, but witnesses to a conflict neither side was prepared to lose. The audience clapped again, some nervously, some gleefully, and the cameras panned to Adele's face, the steel in her eyes, the fire restrained beneath her calm. The trial was underway, and as the studio lights gleamed above, 1,000 living rooms across Britain fell into silence, waiting for the verdict of a battle that was only just beginning. The panel desk gleamed beneath the studio lights, but the brightness only sharpened the lines of confrontation. What had begun as polite sparring was shifting into something harder, more deliberate. Denise Welch no longer looked like a casual host tossing questions in the air. She had assumed a new posture, leaning forward with both elbows pressed to the table, her voice steadier, colder. It was the stance of a prosecutor who had decided the time for courtesy was over. The silence between them stretched, an invisible rope pulled taut. Denise broke it with a voice that cut through the air. "You've built a career on intimacy, Adele. People feel like they know you because you gave them that honesty. So tell me, when did that stop? When did the openness vanish?" It was framed as curiosity, but the cadence was unmistakable. A charge, a demand for confession. The studio audience reacted with a murmur, a ripple of unease like the rustle of papers. In a courtroom gallery, Adele's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in caution. She straightened her back, her voice measured, every syllable deliberate. "I haven't stopped being honest. But honesty doesn't mean handing over every corner of my life. The music is me. It always has been." Denise tilted her head, almost pitying. "But it's not enough anymore, is it? People don't just want the records. They want to know the woman who wrote them. They want the truth, Adele. And you seem determined to hide it." The words hung heavy, like an accusation echoing against courtroom walls. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably, their smiles faltering, as if sensing they were watching someone being cross-examined rather than interviewed. Adele's jaw clenched, the faintest crack in her composure. She turned slightly, addressing the audience as though appealing to the jury itself. "I've given the truth over and over again. It's in every lyric I've ever written. You can hear it in the songs. You can feel it. I don't know why. People insist the truth only counts when it's spoken in gossip magazines or television interviews." Her voice rose, not with anger, but with intensity. The audience broke into applause, some clapping with relief, others with defiance. Yet even as the sound filled the room, Denise's expression did not soften. She smiled, as a barrister might, when a witness confirms the very tension they were trying to expose. Denise pressed again. "But surely you understand, Adele, that without that closeness the bond with your fans weakens. You risk losing what made you beloved. Do you really think you can keep the public at arm's length and still expect their devotion?" The audience hushed. It was no longer a question but a challenge, almost a threat. Loyalty in exchange for disclosure. Adele's fingers tapped against the desk, a rhythm betraying the pressure she was under. She inhaled deeply before speaking, her tone sharpened now. "I don't sing for devotion. I sing because it's the only way I know how to survive myself. If people connect, if they feel something, that's beautiful. But I'm not here to trade my private life for applause." Her words reverberated with quiet thunder. The room seemed smaller, heavier. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing the tension etched in her face. Denise chuckled softly, shaking her head. "That's noble, Adele, truly. But forgive me for saying, it sounds a little convenient. To profit from vulnerability when it sells, then retreat when the questions turn uncomfortable." It was the first real strike, the bluntest accusation yet. Gasps erupted from the audience, some shocked, some thrilled. The courtroom analogy came alive. A prosecutor alleging hypocrisy, daring the defendant to answer under oath. Adele froze, for a heartbeat, her lips pressing into a tight line. She turned her gaze back to Denise, steady and unblinking. "My vulnerability isn't a performance. It's my life, torn apart and stitched together again. I didn't sing about heartbreak to sell records. I sang because I couldn't breathe otherwise. If you think that was for profit, you've missed the whole point." Her words came like testimony, stripped bare, trembling with rawness. For the first time, Denise's smile faltered, the edges hardening. Yet she refused to back down. The audience, roared with applause again, louder this time, some rising to their feet. It was no longer simply entertainment. It had become a trial where each person in the room, and millions at home, were weighing every word like evidence. A panelist to the side tried to step in, laughing nervously. "All right, ladies, let's keep it light." But the effort failed. The duel was too magnetic, too consuming. Adele's hands tightened together, resting on the desk, her knuckles pale. She was calm on the surface, but the storm inside her eyes betrayed the strain. "You don't get to tell me what I— Oh, not you, not anyone. My songs are enough. They've always been enough." The sentence landed with the weight of a closing argument. The studio audience erupted once more, divided between cheers and murmurs. The tension had reached its first crescendo, the trial lines drawn in blood. And in that moment, as Denise leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, one truth was clear. This was no interview. This was an inquisition. The first strike had been delivered, and the storm was only beginning. The room felt heavier now, as though the air itself had thickened under the weight of unspoken truths. The earlier jabs, the sharp questions, had left their mark, but Adele was not retreating. She sat straighter in her chair, her eyes glinting with something more than irritation. This was no longer a polite guest defending herself. This was a woman summoning the voice she had spent a lifetime sharpening against hardship. The studio audience sensed it too, a shift in tone, the quiet before testimony turns into revelation. Cameras crept closer, hungry to capture every tremor in her face, every flicker of defiance in her gaze. Adele's voice emerged low but steady. "You want honesty? Let me tell you something honest. I've been torn apart in headlines. My body, my choices, my family, everything has been carved open for strangers to debate. Do you know what that feels like? To have people you've never met discuss your weight like it's public property? To see your marriage, your heartbreak, plastered as if it's entertainment? That's not intimacy. That's intrusion." The words fell like stones. The audience murmured, hushed again by the gravity of her tone. Denise's posture stiffened, her fingers clasping together as though bracing for what was coming. Adele continued, her hands gesturing softly now, not theatrical, but raw. "I sing because it's the only way I know to make sense of the chaos inside me, but I don't owe anyone the parts of me that don't belong in a song. My son didn't choose this life. My family didn't choose it. And I'll protect them, even if that makes me seem cold or guarded or distant, because they're mine, not yours, not the world's." The silence that followed was thick, reverent. Some in the audience leaned forward, eyes glistening, as though they too had lived the exhaustion of being dissected by others' judgments. Denise broke the pause with a faint laugh, though it rang, hollow in the charged atmosphere. "I understand, Adele, truly. But the public—" Adele cut her off, her voice sharper now, the steel slipping free. "The public or the tabloids? Because they're not the same thing. My fans connect to my songs, not to gossip columns. Don't twist the two together. Don't tell me I have to bleed on command for headlines to count as authenticity." The audience erupted in applause, a roar of approval that drowned out Denise's attempt to respond. The sound reverberated like a gavel striking wood, a collective verdict offered in the middle of testimony. Denise's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something harder, the look of a prosecutor realizing the witness had struck a chord with the jury. She adjusted her seat, leaning back, but her eyes remained locked on Adele, unwilling to concede ground. The panelists around them exchanged quick glances, as though silently debating whether to intervene. But none dared. This was no longer their discussion. It was a duel too magnetic to interrupt. Adele's shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. She softened slightly, her voice quieter now, carrying fatigue rather than fire. "I've lived through things people can't imagine. And yes, I've shared pieces of that in my songs because that's the only way I know how to heal. But what I've kept for myself, that's not betrayal. That's survival." The words lingered, echoing across the set. They were not rehearsed, sound bites. They carried the unmistakable weight of confession. of someone who had been battered by scrutiny and refused to bow any longer. A man in the audience whispered, "She's defending her life up there," and his companion nodded solemnly. It was true. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was testimony before a public that demanded judgment. Denise leaned forward again, unwilling to let silence cement Adele's words as the final note. Her voice was calm, yet there was a sharpness beneath it. "But Adele, don't you think there's a contradiction here? You've given us heartbreak, loss, vulnerability. You've invited the world into your pain. Isn't it fair for people to ask why the door is closed now?" Adele met her gaze head-on, her tone steady but unyielding. "Because I choose the terms. I decide what becomes music and what remains mine. That's not contradiction, Denise. That's agency. And if I didn't hold on to that, I'd have nothing left of myself at all." The audience applauded again, this time longer, some rising from their seats. The atmosphere was electric, a courtroom divided but increasingly leaning toward sympathy for the defendant. Denise inhaled deeply, lips pressed together in a thin smile. She wasn't finished. Not yet. But she knew Adele had shifted the momentum. The other panelists attempted to reframe the tone, chiming in with lighthearted remarks, but their words fell flat against the charged silence. The duel had already consumed the space. Adele leaned back slightly, her voice dropping once more, softer but cutting. "I don't need to explain myself beyond this. I give what I can. And if that's not enough, then maybe people were never listening to the songs in the first place." It was not shouted. It was not dramatic. But it was devastating. A closing statement that pierced deeper than any outburst could. The cameras lingered on her face, the weight of her words still reverberating in the room. The audience, the panel, even Denise herself seemed momentarily silenced. The defense had been delivered. Not rehearsed, not polished, but raw and unrelenting. And as the applause rose once more, louder, more sustained, it became clear. Adele had not simply answered. She had taken control of the narrative, turning accusation into testimony, interrogation into declaration. The trial was far from over, but in that moment, she had won the room. The studio had grown thick with tension, as if every breath risked shattering the fragile order that still held. For minutes they had sparred, questions sharpened like knives, answers delivered like testimony. But there is always a moment when a trial ceases to be a performance and becomes something irreversible. That moment had arrived. Denise Welch's voice cut through the noise, calm yet heavy with provocation. She leaned in, eyes steady on Adele, and spoke with the finality of a closing argument. "All I'm saying is this. The people who lifted you up, the ones who put you where you are, they don't deserve to be shut out. Don't you think, Adele, that maybe you've forgotten to be grateful?" The word landed like a verdict. Ungrateful. It was not a question. It was a charge. The audience gasped audibly, a ripple that moved across the rows like shockwaves. It was a word that carried poison, the kind that can undo years of carefully built trust. Adele froze. Her face remained still, but her silence was deafening. Her hands, resting on the desk, clenched slightly, the whiteness of her knuckles betraying, the storm rising within. For a moment she looked as though she might respond with words, as though she might unleash the fury swelling behind her eyes. But then something shifted. She inhaled deeply, her jaw set, her gaze unblinking. And instead of replying, she rose from her chair. The scrape of wood against the floor echoed in the studio like a gavel strike. The audience erupted, gasps, shouts, scattered applause. The panelists turned their heads in shock, one reaching out instinctively as if to stop her, but she did not waver. Adele stood tall, her figure outlined by the harsh studio lights. Her voice when it came was low but trembling with fire. "I will not sit here and be told I'm ungrateful. Not after everything I've given. Not after everything I've survived." Her words shook with conviction, each syllable resonating, like testimony carved in stone. Denise opened her mouth to respond, but Adele's glare silenced her before a sound could form. The cameras caught it all. The defiance in Adele's posture, the shock etched across the panel's faces, the divided reactions of the audience. It was no longer daytime television. It was theater, trial, history unfolding in real time. Adele's chair remained pushed back, empty, the symbol of her refusal to be diminished. She adjusted her coat with trembling hands, her breath quick but steady. "I came here to share music, not to be dragged through an inquisition. If that's what you wanted, then you've got your moment. But I won't be part of it." And with that, she turned. The studio cameras followed her as she strode toward the edge of the set, the audience caught between applause and stunned silence. Some shouted her name, some booed, but most simply watched, frozen, as she walked away. Denise sat still, her smile thin, her hands folded on the desk like a prosecutor who believed she had cornered her witness. Yet even in that moment, the optics betrayed her. Adele's walk-off was not weakness. It was defiance. It was refusal. The audience buzzed like a restless jury, murmurs rising and falling, uncertain of what they had just witnessed. One woman, in the back, whispered to her neighbor, "She stormed out. She really walked out." Another replied, "And she was right to. That was too far." Back at the desk, one of the panelists tried to steady the atmosphere, offering a nervous laugh. "Well, live television, eh? You never know what's going to happen." But the joke fell flat. The gravity of the moment had already cemented itself. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled, voices overlapping in frantic whispers through headsets. Should they cut to break? Should they follow Adele off stage? Should they let Denise explain? Every second felt like an eternity, every decision a gamble. But for those in the room, it was already decided. The verdict had been delivered the moment Adele stood up. Her storming off was her declaration, her ruling. The terms of this interrogation were unacceptable, and she would not submit to them. Denise finally broke the silence, her tone calm but laced with superiority. "Well, if that's how she wants to react, that's up to her. Some people can't handle a few questions, I suppose." Boos rang out from parts of the audience, drowned quickly by applause from others. The division was stark. The jury was split down the middle, some siding with Welch's unapologetic defense of the public's right to know, others rallying behind Adele's refusal to be shamed. But whatever one believed, the walk-off had seared itself into memory. The cameras replayed the moment again and again, her chair scraping, her words echoing, her figure moving steadily out of frame. It was not the kind of storm that came with shouting or spectacle. It was the quiet, unshakable storm of a woman who had drawn her line and refused to let it be crossed. For those watching at home, the message was clear. Adele's silence, her exit, spoke louder than any defense she could have given. And as the credits of the episode would eventually roll, that single act, the storming off, became the moment everyone would remember. The moment that transformed an interview into a trial, a clash into a verdict. The gavel had fallen, and the world was already debating the judgment. For a moment after Adele's departure, the studio was suspended in a strange silence, the kind that follows a gavel strike in a courtroom after a shocking verdict. The chair she had abandoned sat there like evidence on display, empty yet damning, its absence more powerful than any presence. Denise Welch straightened her notes with calculated composure, as though to remind the audience she was still in command. Her voice, when it returned, carried the tone of a barrister trying to salvage authority after a witness has fled the stand. "Well, I think that speaks volumes, doesn't it? If someone can't answer a fair question, walking away doesn't change the truth." But the audience did not respond as she expected. The division was immediate, visceral. Some clapped in support, affirming her challenge. Others booed openly, their voices sharp, indignant, protective of the singer who had just walked out. One man shouted, "She's had enough," while another countered, "She owes us answers." The studio had become a jury room torn apart, each spectator casting their vote in real time. The other panelists shifted uneasily in their seats. One leaned toward Denise, whispering under the cover of her hand, "That was too far, Denise. You pushed her." The words were caught by a still-hot microphone, faint but audible enough for the audience to catch. A murmur rolled across the room, confirmation that not even those on stage stood united. Producers scrambled behind the glass of the control booth, their voices colliding through headsets. Cut to commercial now. No, hold the shot, the drama is gold. Get a reaction close-up. Where is Adele? Someone find out if she's leaving the building. The chaos backstage mirrored the chaos in the room, every decision carrying the weight of potential scandal. Meanwhile, Denise adjusted her expression, forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded, her demeanor calm. "If you ask me," she said coolly, "storms don't scare me. They reveal who can stand and who runs." Her words triggered another wave of audience reaction, louder this time. Gasps, boos, claps, the clatter of a divided public. One elderly woman in the front row shook her head, her voice breaking with emotion. "She's been through enough. You don't tear down someone who survived so much." The cameras caught her words, amplifying them for every viewer at home. In that moment, the debate was no longer confined to a studio panel. It was spilling outward, into living rooms, into the court of public opinion where verdicts are written not by judges but by millions of voices. The panelists scrambled to reclaim neutrality. One attempted to lighten the mood, her laugh trembling at the edges. "Well, live TV, unpredictable as ever, isn't it?" But the effort fell flat, a brittle mask over something that could no longer be contained. For the audience in the studio, it felt less like entertainment and more like witnessing the fallout of a trial where the accused had left the dock. Some leaned forward, eager for more conflict. Others averted their eyes, unsettled by the rawness of what had unfolded. In the wings, staff hovered nervously. One stagehand whispered to another, "She's in the hallway, shaking. She doesn't want to come back." The information spread, quickly, like wildfire through dry grass, until it reached the ears of a producer who shook his head, resigned. "Then that's it. She's gone." And with that realization, the atmosphere in the studio shifted from anticipation to aftermath. The trial was over. The witness had walked out, and now the world would argue over who was justified and who was guilty. Denise remained unflinching, her chin tilted upward, her gaze steady. Yet in the corners of her expression, the cameras caught something she could not control, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of recognition that the storm she had provoked might not end in her favor.